In this clip, why don't you and I play a little matching game? But before we do that, we're going to have to learn a little bit about this symbol. When we're talking about graphs and scatter plots and statistics, this little symbol, R, is called the correlation coefficient. And it's really cool because it gives you a number that lets you know right away if the dots on your graph are just totally random or if there's a nice trend to be followed. And the way it works, it can give you any number between a positive 1 and a negative 1. So any kind of decimal or 0 or anything in between negative 1 and positive 1. And if you have a positive 1 for your correlation coefficient, that means you have a scatter plot with dots that go perfectly uphill in a nice little line. If you have a correlation coefficient that's a negative 1, it means your scatter plot goes perfectly downhill. All the dots make a line that go downhill. And any number that approaches 0, which is right in the middle, means the dots get more and more random. Okay, you got all that? Keep that in mind. Positive 1, uphill. Negative 1, downhill. Keep that in mind because now we're going to play our matching game. Here's 4 graphs. Graph A, B, C, and D. And you can see that on each graph, the dots are arranged in a different pattern. Now let's see if we can match 4 correlation coefficients to these graphs. In no particular order, we have a correlation coefficient of exactly 1, a positive 1, a correlation coefficient of 0.05, 0.62, and finally negative 0.76. Okay, let's look at this first one. R equals 1. Which one of these 4 graphs do you think would have a correlation coefficient of exactly 1? Well, it turns out it's going to be graph A. It's the first one. And it has a correlation coefficient of exactly 1 because, as you can see, the dots are going uphill and they're perfectly lined up. How about this next one? R equals 0.05. You remember that a correlation coefficient close to 0 means the graph doesn't really have much of a trend. It's pretty random. And 0.05 is definitely a number close to 0. It's going to be graph D. And that's just because, well, look at these dots. They're all over the place. It's pretty random. How about this one? R equals 0.62. That's not really close to 0, but it's not all that close to 1 either. It is a positive number, so we definitely need a graph that's going uphill. It looks like graph C has a trend that's sort of going uphill, even though the dots are a little bit random. So I'd say the correlation coefficient for C is 0.62. And by default, well, that just leaves negative 0.76 for graph B. It's negative because the dots are going downhill. And it's getting close to a value of negative 1 because these dots are starting to form a pretty nice solid trend, a nice straight line going downhill. And there you have it, 4 different looks at the correlation coefficient.